Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Thursday, May 7th, 2026. I'm John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
Social commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
And joining us today, our contributing editor Poobah at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Jonathan Schanzer. Hi, John.
Hey, John.
Jonathan, you are one of our go-to guys to talk about just what the hell is happening in the war. And I think everybody in America and the world is saying to themselves, what the hell is happening in the war? And this is a fast-moving, very confusing story. We now have this bit of detail that seems to might explain why it is that Donald Trump, behaving in an extremely inconstant fashion over the last 48 hours, announced and then withdrew his program, Project Freedom, for the escorting of ships out of the Hormuz Strait. The story that we are getting, we got a bit of it last night, and then we're getting new versions of it this morning, is that it largely ended because the Saudis said, don't be doing this. You can't base your planes or take any offensive military action out of our territory, which then seemed extremely bizarre and was very hard to understand in the first leak story about this from NBC News. And we're getting a clearer picture of it this morning from Israeli news sources and others who say the Saudis weren't blindsided. They did know about it. They became increasingly concerned that Donald Trump was so intent on getting a deal with the Iranians to end the war that he would halt or not pull the trigger if the Iranians decided to involve Saudi Arabia in their response to Project Freedom. If it started to rain missiles on Saudi Arabia, that Trump would not intervene on behalf of the Saudis because he did not want anything to interfere with the progress to a deal. So, Jonathan, do you trust this story? Do you think this is credible? And are we looking at a situation in which the president, who has been the most stalwart person in his own administration in pursuit of the military aim of getting his hands on the dust and, basically taking Iran out as a player on the international stage, that he's blinking?
So I think there are a couple things that are happening that's probably worth unpacking. One is just this idea of whether we're getting close to a deal. And I think that's first and foremost on everybody's mind right now in the region. And it's, I think, what's most important to me. And on that, I have to say, I am not seeing any real progress. And this is what's so interesting to me. I think every couple of days, Donald Trump comes out and he says, we're getting closer. It's going to get better. Like, I can see it. It's going to happen, folks. Just, trust me. And this has been happening every couple of days, every week. It's been a regular trend with him. I think he keeps giving the Iranians an opportunity. And I think the Iranians are loath to take it. They just do not want to walk through the door that he continues to open for them. But from everything that I'm hearing, things are exactly as they were when the ceasefire began several weeks ago. Nothing has changed in terms of the Iranian position, and nothing's really changed that much from the U.S. position either. And so we're stuck. We find ourselves in this position where the U.S. has to continue to worry about the flow of oil coming in and out, or ships coming in and out of the Strait of Hormuz, and oil coming out. So then that's where we get to this Saudi piece. The Saudis, I think, have been compromised for some time. You may recall that in 2023, leading up to the October 7th attacks, there was an agreement that they struck. It was a Chinese agreement. It was brokered by the Chinese between Iran and Saudi Arabia. people don't talk about this deal. The deal actually, I think, still exists in some shape or form. And the idea is that if the Saudis stopped attacking Iran in their media, in particular Iran International, if anybody ever reads that publication, it's actually a pretty interesting publication. It is a very Iran-centric, the Iranian people, not the regime, right? It's about basically overthrowing the regime in Iran. This was starting to really get under the skin of the Iranians, and the Saudis agreed to dial back on some of the rhetoric. And in return, the Iranians agreed to stop sicking the Houthis on Saudi Arabia, and there was some sort of understanding that the two sides had reached. I actually went with some FDD colleagues to Saudi shortly after that agreement was signed, and we were trying to get a sense from the Saudis about what was in the agreement, and they refused to tell us. They told us that this was classified and they can't talk about it. I think this has been sort of a baseline for understanding what's happened all the way through this war. Why were the Saudis not getting attacked by the Houthis after October 7th? The Houthis were attacking all these, ships in the Red Sea, and they're attacking American ships, and they're attacking Israel, and yet Saudi somehow stayed out of this. In other words, what's going on here right now, at least best as I can tell, is the Saudis are still trying to hedge. They're trying to figure out how to navigate all of this to incur the least amount of damage. And so what they've done here is consistent with everything that we've seen up until now, which is they're still trying to navigate this. They're working with the Pakistanis. They're still talking to the Houthis. They're still talking to the Iranians, trying to make sure that they don't incur a lot of damage. Bottom line, the Saudis are not exactly a profile in courage here. They are doing what they can to preserve their investments, to preserve their wealth, to preserve their stability. This stands in stark contrast to the Emiratis, who are all in. They want to defeat the Islamic Republic, and they put their money where their mouths are. The Israelis are there, deploying iron beams, shooting down missiles, and they're doing everything they can to help. The Saudis have not bought into this normalization structure, and they're still trying to play Muslim politics, if you will. And that's, I think, the best way of describing what's going on without knowing all the details, because they're still pretty fuzzy.
So as you understand it militarily, if Trump called the operation off 12 hours after he started it, the American assets in Saudi Arabia must have been critical to the effort, which I think indicates the flaw in the design of the effort, which people were like very confused about, right? He announced, we're opening the straits, we are escorting the ships. And then 5 minutes later is, we're not really escorting the ships. We're going to keep an eye on the ships. And we have methods to kind of like virtually escort the ships, kind of. Maybe we'll escort some of them, but we'll escort others of them. No one will know which ones we're escorting and we're not escorting, something like that. And that basically there is no cheap way around opening the Strait of Hormuz that does not involve us putting our own shipping at risk to escort the ships out of Hormuz, and that this was a gimmick that got exposed as a gimmick. And Trump's like, okay, well, I guess we just have to pull back and not do it because, we don't have the resources either to open the strait conventionally, or, I'm worried that my deal that you, as you say, is pretty much non-existent is going to collapse.
Can I actually ask about a further question on that? I'm curious what Jonathan thinks, because we actually, in terms of a ceasefire, it doesn't really exist because Iran has continued to fire at American assets in the area, and we've been able to successfully intercept those missiles and whatnot. But I thought it was an interesting question that was asked of General Kane in a recent press briefing about exactly those attacks. And he said, well, they don't meet the threshold for retaliation. And when he was pressed on that, basically he said that's a political question. So when the president decides that this ceasefire is sort of over because of the way that Iran is behaving, that meets the threshold. So I'm curious where, if that's a negotiating tool, like we'll take a few attempted hits to keep the peace while we're trying to negotiate a broader settlement. What's going to be the trigger for Trump? He has said if they cannot come to an agreement, we will go back to bombing them. So from your perspective right now, where we are on Thursday, what would be a trigger for Trump to actually resume some fighting in the region?
So I mean, I think what we're all putting our finger on right now is something that it's actually a deeper flaw and a deeper challenge that we're going to have to come to terms with. And actually, John, I got to say, this is a piece I may want to write for you. I'm just throwing it on you now.
Hey,
But
here we go.
okay, here we go.
It's a live pitch.
This
I love
is
it.
how
Everybody's going to hear it,
this
and we'll
is
see
how
whether
the
John
sausage
agrees.
is made.
Right.
This is how the sausage is made. Now you
Welcome
know.
to Shark Tank.
Yeah. I've spent a few days, overseas thinking about this, and it's amazing what happens when you stop reading social media for a little bit and let your brain digest some of the information. But our problem actually is one of munitions and about putting boots on the ground. I mean, this actually keeps tracking back to some of the other things that we've talked about here and that I've written about with you. The cost of the munitions right now, as they begin to dwindle, and we've all seen the reports, we've heard these reports, that we have these exquisite munitions that are extremely precise and they can do immense damage to things that are of value. We ran out of things that are of value. The only thing that is left that is truly of value right now is the oil structures inside Iran. And the president doesn't want to destroy those for two reasons. One, he wants to save that oil for the people of Iran so that if and when the regime falls, that the people can inherit the wealth of the country and not have to rebuild it from scratch. The other part of it is I think, he wouldn't mind it for U.S. companies to get in there and make trillions of dollars through the production of oil and petrochemicals and other things that are related to the oil industry, and destroying it would be a huge problem for him, right? So the idea of burning munitions on, insignificant or relatively insignificant targets is a problem. Putting our vessels that are worth a hell of a lot more into the Strait of Hormuz and putting them potentially at risk of getting hit from Yahant missiles or other shoulder-fired type of, smaller munitions that the Iranians have that could do immense damage to our naval assets, that's not worth it for him either. And so when you see him continue to say we're making progress, when you continue to see him say, we're close to a deal, what he actually wants is he wants everybody to stand down. And I think the regime understands this. I think the regime understands that he doesn't want to go back in because it's not worth it. It's not worth the munitions. It's not worth putting our men and women in danger. And so we're at this sort of impasse where, and I think this actually, look, there's two or three problems here. There's number one, we keep using munitions that are not, they're expensive and they're limited, and we're now going to have to restock them, and it's going to take some time. And this is, I think, weighing heavily on the Pentagon. It's weighing heavily on the White House. And I think they're trying to figure out what's next. They've arrived at a crossroads and they don't know what to do. I think that's part of this. I think there's another part of this also, which is the rules-based international order. The idea of only hitting, valid military targets. If we've run out of those and we haven't won after shellacking the Iran, we've beaten them, right? But they're still hanging on. They're not going to surrender. And so we're stuck exactly where we are. That rules-based international order is working against us right now.
Right.
And that raises some really uncomfortable questions about the nature of warfare.
You published a piece in Commentary this month about how to declare victory or how to achieve victory when your rival won't surrender. And that we need to understand that you can win a war without your rival bending the knee. But this has become very hard for us to understand or to get a real sense of. Abe has a third way, and I would call it the Dayenu way. So Dayenu, for people who don't know it, is the central song of the Passover Seder. And it is a song of praise to God for everything that God has done for us from the beginning of the Exodus from Egypt. So if he had only gotten us out of Egypt, it would have been enough. Dayenu is translated as it would have been enough. If he'd only given us manna in the desert, but had not led us to Mount Sinai, it would have been enough, and so on and so on and so on. Abe has been articulating for the last couple of days the idea that what we have done in Iran, what the United States has done in Iran from Operation Midnight Hammer through this operation, destroying Iran's aggressive capacities in the elimination of much of its, if not most of its, ballistic missiles or missiles that exist, and then the missile factories and the nuclear program and the centrifuges and all of that, that we're at a Dayenu moment. If Trump ends the war tomorrow unilaterally, in Abe's estimation, this all would have been enough. I'm not sure I agree with that, but Abe, do you want to sort of can you lay this out a little?
Well, I should say that I have both gratitude and greed in my heart at this moment. Greed isn't the right word, but I also want more and am grateful for what has been done. And I just can't lose sight of the gratitude part of it, because I never expected to see this. I mean, this is how I've been articulating it. We've seen so many presidents talk about hitting Iran, about the window closing, about we could have done it 7 years ago, but now we can't do it today. It's the time is wrong now. So, and all of that melted away, and we hit Iran's nuclear program. We hit a ton of their missile stocks. We took out levels of regime leadership. That's incredible. I really didn't think it was going to happen. And I didn't think it was going to happen up until it happened. I didn't think Operation Midnight Hammer was going to happen and then be followed up by this. And I just think you can't look back at the past 20-something years of kind of U.S. paralysis on this, and then see this sudden world-shaking change and not appreciate it. So, in other words, if we were to walk away from it today, I still think it has done a world of good. I also think that if the U.S. can bear to choke off the regime's lifeblood with weeks or months of a blockade, that would be much better.
Okay, so Jonathan, this is, I think, one of your points also, just to dovetail, or at least in private exchanges with me. Time is on our side, not on the Iranian side, but not politically. So if you were absent the American public opinion and the unpopularity of the war and sort of the media atmosphere and all of that, if Trump just doggedly stuck to things being as they are in some sense, with maybe a little bombing here, a little of this, a little of that, but like continuing to choke off the Iranian access to the outside world, let's say, through its oil exports and through whatever it's doing, might want to do to extend its power, that this is unsurvivable for the Iranians. But we're not in an ideal world in which we don't have to factor in these other things that are clearly what is haunting or disturbing Trump's own consciousness and compelling him to a constant test of, well, what if we did this and then went and said, let's get a deal? What if we stopped here and they gave us the dust? Wouldn't that be amazing? I really want that dust. Give me that dust. So how do we put these two together? Look, tactically for the United States,
yeah,
if we could just stay here till the end of the year, the Iranian regime will collapse.
Look,
but that would mean
yes.
6 months of sitting here doggedly, essentially like a water siege of Stalingrad, and just having the Iranians literally choke on their excess oil, capping the wells, having their fleet trapped, all of that.
So, I mean, I think it's interesting. I do think that there is a way forward with the economic war. And this is obviously stuff that I worked on when I was a Treasury guy, and I still very much appreciate the playbook. And I do think that, I mean, today's Thursday, May 7th, right? So in about another week, I understand the Iranians may have to cap the wells. And then you start to see things really get bad for them. I think there's more we can do. We can cut off their banks from the international system. We can put on more sanctions. We can add more tariffs. We can bomb things that are significant for them. And I think it will hurt. Let me just say, though, that that's what we do. What do? They probably attack Saudi Arabia. They probably attack the UAE. They go after the oil producers in the region, and they try to do economic damage to us and to the entire world. There is some measure that is, I guess, moving forward at the UN right now that's going to try to condemn the Iranians for what they're doing in the Strait of Hormuz.
Well, that'll just that's it.
That's it. Right.
That's
so,
it.
A very firm letter they'll
letter
write
to the
Iran.
Times.
Right.
You know?
I mean,
Yeah.
right. Weapon of mass discussion, right? No, we don't expect anything to come out of this, right?
Yeah.
So what I expect there, I mean, the enemy always gets a vote. And so, yes, we can do a lot of damage to them. But I think, look, this is what I'm wrestling with. And it's this rules-based international order, right? We've hammered this regime. We have the ability to hurt them further economically, but they still won't. If they're not going to surrender, if they're not going to capitulate, and we want to escalate, I don't even know what's left, right? We're going to bomb and keep using munitions that we don't want to use against things that are possibly militarily significant. We have put ourselves into a bind with the rules that we've created for ourselves. And I do think that this actually has prompted us to start to think about the future of warfare. Look, the Israelis have been dealing in this for a long time, too. They keep beating Hamas and they keep beating Hezbollah, but they can't finish the job because every time they get close to finishing the job, everybody starts screaming about genocide. If the United States decides that we want to actually do more damage to the country of Iran, the Islamic Republic, it may require some tougher choices that will absolutely invite condemnation and charges of war crimes and the like. In other words, where do we go on this escalation ladder? I think Trump understands that there's the escalation that's not worth it from the perspective of munitions, which will harm us if and when the Chinese decide to invade Taiwan and we don't have enough in the tank. We don't want to go down that road. Do we want to do more to prevent them economically and maybe from the perspective of, I don't know, other things that the regime needs in order to survive that could invite huge amounts of condemnation internationally? We have a challenge. These are shackles that we put on ourselves a century ago, right? End of World War II, 80 years ago, right? We create this rules-based international order, and now we're living with it, and it's hurting us, and it's hurting our allies. And I do think this is a central question that we're going to have to wrestle with. Trump is struggling with the system that he inherited right now, because he doesn't know how to escalate in ways that won't harm us or invite a torrent of criticism against him, and maybe even war crimes charges and the like.
It's interesting that you're talking about some of the domestic accusations that were already leveled after some of his Truth Social posts earlier, a few months earlier, about, decimating, throwing back to the Stone Ages and stuff like that. But was it yesterday or the day before? Vice President Vance was in Iowa stumping for a candidate, and he said something that really struck me, because he was talking to farmers and about their concerns, and he acknowledged that fertilizer prices have gotten much, much higher as a result of this conflict. Gas prices are, 50% higher than they were when we started this. But then he said, but, it's just a blip. This is just a blip. This is a little thing. We're going to wrap it up. And that, to me, signaled something about some internal political dynamics in the administration itself that will also have to be resolved, I think, if there is going to be a strong message that the war is over, or that we're going forward and really making sure to end what we're doing on good footing in the region. And then all of this, obviously, you brought up China. That's next Wednesday. And do you have any sense of the message that Trump wants to, or the feeling Trump wants to bring to that negotiation? Because correct me if I'm wrong, but one of Iran's leaders was in China this past week. So there's a whole issue there with how we're going to negotiate and triangulate on that score. Do you have any sense of there being a particularly strong position that the U.S. could be taking going into that discussion with Xi?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Xi summit was supposed to be like 6 weeks ago.
Right.
And it was postponed. And it was postponed because of the war. And, I think Trump had hoped that he was going to bring sort of a fait accompli to Xi Jinping and say, look, we just took over the Persian Gulf region. We now control everything here, this energy is ours, and you're going to have to negotiate with us. And, we're carving up the globe into spheres of influence, and, and this one's ours. I think it's far more complicated. It's much more opaque now for Trump heading into that meeting. And I think, one could argue that maybe that has, given Xi at least some advantage. I do think, though, that the Persian Gulf states have to see that the Chinese were malign actors in all of this. I think that the Arabs are going to hold a grudge toward the Chinese for quite some time, right? I mean, they were the ones that were providing some of the precursors for the chemicals and the motors for the drones and intelligence that would attack American bases that ultimately hit some of these countries. So if you're the Saudis, if you're the Emirates, if you're the Kuwaitis, if you're the Iraqis, and you see that the Chinese have been able to traverse the Strait of Hormuz and others have not, you're going to be pretty grumpy about all this. The question is, how much does China pay a price for this when this thing is over? Or do they find a way to exploit this? I think it's still kind of an unknown, but I do think that the president's probably entering into these talks not with the advantage that he had hoped. And I think Xi is probably licking his chops a little bit from that.
Okay,
Can I ask about another aspect of this going forward and looking ahead on not just China, but I want to ask about the IRGC. It feels to me like we had years, decades, even for some, warning that the IRGC had to be reined in internationally. That, whatever you were going to, whatever was going on with it inside Iran, you could not have the IRGC assassinating dissidents, in Berlin cafes. That there was a line that had been crossed that was, Putin-esque, and yet it was not being treated as such, and that the IRGC was not the government and not the army, but like this kind of like ghost in the machine force, and that therefore you could sanction them and rein them in a way that you couldn't other governments, right? There are limits to like official sanctions we'll put on the Chinese government, even though we hate a million things they're doing, right? But there was this feeling that the IRGC, that their advantage was also their disadvantage, that not being the official government, we could do stuff about them, treat them as a terrorist organization, whatever. Now, that seems clear that it was a mistake not to do so, right? So what happens now that the state essentially has been inherited by, the last Revolutionary Guard standing sort of situation, that now it's really in the IRGC's hands? What happens going forward? Did anybody learn a lesson from this? And can anything be done to stop this buildup of these kinds of shadow states in the future, but specifically the IRGC?
Look, yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I will say that there's been a growing chorus of countries that have decided to sanction the IRGC. I think the Canadians, the Australians, obviously the Israelis, Argentina, the U.S., right? I mean, there is a growing group of countries internationally that have decided to take action against it. The question is, like, at this point, when the regime has lost a year's worth of GDP, it has lost an enormous amount of its missiles and missile launchers and air defenses and all of these assets that the IRGC has, and yet it continues to fight on. I mean, the mentality here, it shouldn't be a surprise, right? But this is the same mentality that we see from Hezbollah, the same mentality that we see from Hamas. They're essentially a terrorist organization running a country, right? Then they're just like, we're not going to lose. We're not going to win, but we're not going to lose. We're just going to keep fighting, and we don't care, right? Because we're on a jihad, right? And this is, we've been told by our supreme leader and then his son, who may be a vegetable or maybe just a cardboard cutout, but we're still fighting in the, in kind of the vision of Khomeini from 79. That's where we are right now. This is an ideological battle. It's a refusal to submit. And I don't know if any further action could be taken, the designation, the bombing. I mean, how much more can you do to weaken this terrorist organization that is running the country? Look, at the end of the day, the answer to the IRGC, the answer to all of this is still the people of Iran, right? If the people come out and they start doing what needs to be done, and then the Israelis and the United States and maybe some of the surrounding Gulf countries provide some close air support by drone, and provide the weapons and the training and the cash and the secure communications and all the things that they need in order to get this done. That's the answer to the IRGC. That's the answer to the besieged. That's the answer to this crisis. But how do you engineer a revolution like that?
It's worse if you think about it, because if the strategic position of the United States vis-a-vis Iran at this moment looks to the Iranian people the way it looks to Richard Haas of the Council on Foreign Relations and Michael McFaul of Stanford, which is, oh boy, Trump is really getting humiliated out here. The Iranian people aren't going to rise up. They're going to be like, well, you know, the regime is doing pretty well, all things considering, and we had real hopes that maybe we could replace it, but I don't know, like, you know, they're stronger than they look, and we're not going to just go stand up in front of them and then get mowed down by the tens or hundreds of thousands. A regime controlled by the IRGC, like Hamas, like Hezbollah, why we have such difficulty coping with looking through their eyes, looking in the way that, you know, Clausewitz taught us we needed to understand war, is that we even Trump, even Mr. Realist and amoral and doesn't care about democracy and all that, cannot reckon or fathom with a regime responsible for 90 million people that genuinely wouldn't really care if 5 million of them died all of a sudden, if it meant keeping 120,000 people from the IRGC in power. He has that problem with Russia, in my opinion, that he cannot believe that the Russians wouldn't make a good deal with the Iranians, because look how many Russians have died. And Putin, 100 million Russians could die. That Putin is Stalin. He doesn't care how many Russians die. That's not his. In fact, maybe that's a net positive for him. And we cannot get this into our heads. It's very hard for us to think, well, they're not just going to give up and like make a deal, because look how costly this is for them.
Right.
They don't necessarily see it as a cost.
They probably don't. But I will tell you one thing, and I have been struck by this. You know, the messaging in this has been pretty interesting. If you look at like Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister, you look at Pezeshkian, you look at some of the other, you know, thugs from the regime, they're trolling us. Right? They're trolling Trump. I don't know if you've seen some of their tweets.
And these are the non-IRGC people. You're talking about the political. I know they are connected to the IRGC, but these are the political leaders, the head of the parliament, the prime minister.
They are the figureheads that speak basically on behalf of the IRGC, and they're the ones who were giving a lot of the direction to the IRGC. And they're kind of laughing, right? Because they understand that Trump has to play politics and all they have to do is survive. What we really need right now is an information operation that is designed to try to paint a different picture, which is, you know, namely that this regime, even if it's not true, we should be trying to say that this regime is on the verge of collapse. This is what eventually will bring the people out. If they believe that the regime is starting to buckle, if they believe that this regime is hemorrhaging cash, that it's running out of weapons, that it's losing legitimacy. This was kind of what we saw at the beginning of the war. And, you know, Israel was doing a pretty good job of painting that picture. Trump was, he was not willing to go that far, but he certainly was telling the people to hold on, and some of that messaging. We've stopped doing that. We're not even trying to delegitimize this regime. I don't know. There is an information strategy that is missing here, right? That if all this regime needs to do is survive, we need to delegitimize the regime.
The message that the regime is collapsing got completely fouled up with the message that regime change has been achieved and we have the right people and we're speaking to the right people, and they've given us gifts, and they've given indications that they're ready to do this and to do that. So it's not even a question of whether or not the Iranian people think the regime is strong or weak. They have no, if you're going by that, by the U.S. information, you have no idea what you're dealing with. You have no idea what's on your hands. Is the same with the American public.
It's a great point.
And John, what John was saying earlier about, I think this ties into what John was saying earlier. If you have a president who does foreign policy as deal making, it actually can be hard to come up with an information message of that sort, because he's holding out the option of actually negotiating with some of the people who are there, and so that is counterproductive to that form of deal making. And we saw that. I think that's absolutely exactly how he's been handling Putin all this time. And that is a weakness of that form of strategy once you've actually started a war. I mean, if you're fighting, then I think that has to be set aside. But that the lack of attention to the Iranian people from this administration recently is very disheartening. I will say Rubio gave some wonderful remarks, just very general remarks about how he sees the role of the U.S. At the press briefing yesterday, I thought he did very well. There's a reason all those remarks went viral. It was a very hopeful, optimistic message about how we see ourselves in the world. And I think that kind of messaging has also been missing. And I mean, we've complained about it here and there, and I think we should all be willing to be patient as he's prosecuting an actual these battles. But it's time now. I mean, this is a sort of crucial moment, and people want to hear some of that. And certainly we owe that to the Iranian people.
I just think, and now if we sort of move on to Israel a little bit. So Israel's role at the beginning of this war was so crucial because it was Israel's intelligence on where the leadership was, the decapitation effort at the very beginning of the war, Israel's junior partner role in softening sights, targeting things, doing all of that. Israel has receded in part because the aggressive offensive military operations have receded, and Israel has turned its attention to Hezbollah in the north. And we have this very strange situation in which, because it is so focused and because it is actually politically so crucial, I think, to Bibi Netanyahu's chances in the election, that he be able to say that he made a material difference in ending Hezbollah's reign of air terror in the north, that if we need to go back in, we need to restart the war, we in the United States are going to need Israel's attention, help, intelligence focus, its ability to do what it has to do to maybe stimulate the sources of opposition within the regime, which is its particular strength, is human intelligence on the ground inside Iran, knowing what's going on inside Iran. But I'm not saying Israel is distracted. It is engaged in a massive and very important military effort. Can it walk and chew gum at the same time, Jonathan? Can it continue the mission in Lebanon if Trump, after this, I'm giving you a week to make a deal, Iran, and Trump actually does say, okay, we're back on, the hell with you, we're back on, and we're going to do whatever we can to make you, crash and burn. Can Israel go back into Iran while continuing to degrade Hezbollah?
It can. I think right now, I mean, I see all of this as sort of interregnum, right? I mean, we're sort of not at war, but we are at war. There's this question about the Strait of Hormuz and what's going to happen next. You don't see missiles flying into Israel. You don't see, there's not big booms happening. It's a lot of little things that are happening all over. And I think the Israelis are, if you look at actually what's happened over the last couple of days, the Israelis took out 2 very senior Hezbollah leaders within the last 24 hours. They also took out Khalil al-Hayya's son. This is a guy from the Nukhba forces in Hamas. So they took out the newly elected, I'm going to put that in air quotes, but the newly elected leader of Hamas. They took out his son, who was a senior figure in the Hamas military. They're notching achievements that are kind of intelligence-based achievements right now while they wait for some clarity from Trump about what will happen next. Let me just say, the concerns that Trump has about munitions, I'm going to assume the same holds for the Israelis. The Pentagon is still the purveyor of those munitions to the Israelis. So they're probably like, yeah, I don't know if we want you to start bombing the hell out of everybody right now because you're going to be using the same stuff that we're trying to conserve. So there's some interesting stuff that's happening here. I don't know where it all heads, but I do get a sense that this is not the worst thing in the world. Wars go through ebbs and flows. You see this when you study other wars. There's a moment right now where I think everyone's trying to take stock about what the proper course of action will be for victory. But I think, this gets right back to this idea of the siege on Iranian oil. I think it's the way forward, at least for right now. I think hold fast, squeeze them as much as you possibly can, force them to cap the wells, force them to start to suffer economically more than they already are, and see where that takes us without having to expend the munitions and letting Israel continue to fight. I don't want to say it's tactical because they are taking out strategic targets, but they're doing so in a way that feels wise and measured and opportunistic. And that's not a bad thing for where we are right now. If you think about overall, every one of the fronts that Israel's been fighting since October 7th, their enemies are weaker, and they're going to be weaker for the foreseeable future. And this is to Abe's point, we've already achieved a huge amount in terms of weakening the Islamic Republic and putting it on its back foot. All of these things are good. Now I think we just sort of find out, can the politics and the economic warfare, can that play out in a way that further redounds to our advantage? The thing about all of this, and it does drive me crazy, in the age of social media, in the age of this sort of less than 24-hour news cycles, everybody just wants to know, did we win? Like right now, did we get to where we wanted to? God, read some history, guys. Wars sometimes take a while to play out, and I'm not unhappy with where we are. I do think that we're shackled a bit by our own rules, but I do think that if we let this thing play out a bit more, we could get more advantage from it.
That's such a good.
Can I ask a weird question?
I just want to say that's such a good. Seth, go for it. Go for it.
I was just going to ask, like, what do the Israelis? Do we know? Do you know? Does anybody know what the Israelis know about what's happening day to day? We get a lot of stories about this, and we're just, as you said, we're having this discussion about, like, we don't really know where he's going with stuff, right? And we had the report we discussed earlier. The Saudis, they knew that they were going to do Project Freedom, but maybe they didn't know that Trump wasn't going to be willing to retaliate if they got whatever. What do the Israelis know when you talk about them saying maybe we don't want Trump to use all those munitions because the Pentagon is our source, their source for them too, whatever. What do they know day to day? What do our allies know day to day? We don't know a lot of stuff. Trump has us thrown for a loop, but is that not the situation elsewhere? Like, are the Israelis fully informed about what's going on, or does nobody know what Trump, like, how, what's this, what is the situation there?
I don't know how to answer that. And I'm kind of glad I don't know how to answer that, to be honest. I mean, that just seems like something I shouldn't know. But I mean, look, I think that there is a general understanding that they need to be smart about how they wage this next phase of the war kinetically, how much they expend and what they target. Because again, if they took out all the major targets that they wanted to, then, in that sense, mission accomplished. We've now reached a new phase. The regime is not capitulated. We need to fight smarter now. And I think taking a little time to figure that out is fine. I think everybody understands that is what is being called for right now, is some wisdom, trying to figure out what is the next strategy. I think, if there's any frustration that I feel, and again, getting back to Abe's sort of, the Dayenu thing, like, this has all been really good. What I think maybe we didn't think about, when I say we, the Pentagon, the Israelis, what happens if the regime is still standing at the end of all of this? What do we do next? And maybe we didn't have a good sense of that. Maybe we really thought that we were going to bring it all down and it was all going to collapse and the people were going to come out. Okay, the John Grisham ending did not occur. Okay, what is the messier way forward where we still win? I think that's what we're trying to figure out right now. And that's not a bad thing, right? I mean, these things happen in war, right? Everybody, they always talk about it. Every military plan looks brilliant until you make contact with the enemy. We've made contact. It's worked, but it hasn't worked as well as we wanted it to. So now what? And I think that's what we're trying to figure out as Trump keeps saying the door's open for diplomacy. And we've decided not to put our ships in the middle of harm's way. And we've decided not to expend massive amounts of munitions moving forward. But we have an economic war. Follow Scott Bessent, man. That guy, his recent briefings, got to keep watching him, because I think this guy is going to be the new captain for at least a little bit. And I don't mind that, because at least it gives us some sense of, we're making some progress here. We're hurting the regime economically. Let's do more of that.
Does that then, you think, require Trump to sort of change the initial 4 or 5 goals he gave as the purpose of the war? The nuclear materials, the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, there are a couple of things that I think were the touch points for the American people understanding why we were doing this. If those shift, is it going to require him saying, now we're in this economic war, we're in this blockade, we're doing it this way because this is what we think is best?
So Christina, I love that you frame it that way, because it's like there's something like almost heartwarming about this, as if like Trump's statements about the war hold from day to day. Right? Because
I'm hanging on to a thread here.
Right. I mean, but what he said he wanted from the beginning of this has changed multiple times, and this is classic Trump, right? He maintains that maximum flexibility, and he continues to.
It has and it hasn't. I would define it as follows. Part of the problem with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the war on terror declared after September 11th, if you remember, George W. Bush literally said this war could take 75 years. You'll see some of it, you won't see others of it, and we are going to, fight this and fight it on the beaches and all of that. But then what did that mean? Like, what is this war? What are the aims and the goals? If the goals are to prevent terrorist attacks on U.S. soil, then it's been 25 years and the war has been wildly successful. If you ask the American people, I think they would say the war on terror had been a failure. One of the reasons they would say that is because we had these defined missions in the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. The war in Iraq, we were taking out Saddam Hussein's regime. War in Afghanistan, we were taking out the Taliban. And then the mission had to grow because we couldn't just leave them standing there, and we didn't know if we didn't know where the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction were, which turned out did not exist. And so the wars then distended themselves. I think Trump has defined the terms of this war very clearly. And the thing is, he just has to get to the end of it without tacoing. So
I think that's true.
One of them
but I think to Christine's point, he can continue to pivot on he can say, look, some of these major goals of ours, they still exist out there and we're still going to achieve them. But for now, we've got some new challenges ahead of us. Right. Here's what those look like. Here's what we're going to do now.
I think it's very definable now. One of them came in later, but it was inevitable that it was going to be there, right? So the immediate, which is new because it wasn't part of the first thing, is Hormuz has to be taken off the map the Iranian threat to Hormuz has to be removed, and free transit in Hormuz has to be achieved somehow. That wasn't part of the original goal because Hormuz wasn't closed then, but that's what the war has introduced. That's the enemy's vote, right?
Yep.
But the other two are, one was not explicit and one was. The other two are the destruction of the complete destruction, obliteration forever of the Iranian nuclear program, as symbolized now by the physical capture and holding of the Iranian nuclear material. So that is a goal. It's a very ambitious goal. It's a complicated goal because it means going in and digging it out and taking it with you. But it is an explicable goal. The other, which was not a goal, but I think can happen really forever, the other two goals can't be achieved forever without the third goal, which is regime change. In other words, you can't ensure that Hormuz will never be threatened with closure again until you remove the regime that closed it. because it will always have that,
you
right?
put your finger on it, John.
Okay.
Like, this is our biggest problem. All the other problems are symptoms of the big problem, which is that there is a regime in Iran that is a problem for the entire region, for the United States. It's a blight on the planet. And I think it's increasingly clear right now, as they hold 20% of the world's energy hostage, that this is the problem. And I think, look, I understand why Trump doesn't want to go there. I understand why everybody is phobic of of regime change after 2 disastrous attempts at it in the past, and especially in this region. But I think we're just going to have to get back to the drawing board again. We've reached a different phase in this war, and every phase you're going to reach is going to require
say he's phobic and everybody's phobic about it, but it seems to me that if we've now gotten to the point where we need to ensure that one of the ends of this war is that nobody ever closed the Strait of Hormuz again, or goes around closing straits in the world, then regime change, which once seemed science fictional or too difficult to achieve, may be the easier of the two. In other words, like,
it becomes
if you
imperative.
change the regime, you could open Hormuz. If you open Hormuz, that doesn't mean you can change the regime or that Hormuz can't be closed again. So that's where the enemy's vote plays a role. Jonathan, I know you got to go quickly, so I wanted to just shift to a slightly different topic. We're hearing that the Department of Justice is finally launching some investigations into the bizarre fact of trading on the international betting markets in events surrounding this war, particularly now this question of whether or not immense amounts of money were being moved in the hours before Trump declared Operation Project Freedom. Betting on, I guess, oil futures and where they are and all of that. And this, together with several other things, a special forces guy who placed a bet as the Maduro raid was going on in Venezuela and others, I think raises a gigantic worldwide problem with the existence of these international betting markets, that we have simultaneously liberalized our ideas about gambling across the United States in particular, and sort of making it, and allow, the Super Bowl has half the ads on the Super Bowl are about gambling on the Super Bowl and that kind of thing, which would have been unimaginable to me like 30 years ago. And we are now talking about a geopolitical crisis that could be introduced by the fact that somebody somewhere using, Bitcoin that no one can track, places $100 million position on something, and that person is in charge of policy in the United States or another country, knows stuff, can affect policy one way or the other. It's like Pete Rose betting on his own games. Jonathan, I mean, I just strikes me that like this is an entirely new phenomenon. We've spent many wars over the last 200 years. There have been these commissions to deal with people who are war profiteering. This is like an entirely different thing here. It's not like getting a government contract to build ships. It is betting on policy changes, which can be affected by a very small number of people without moving a lot of levers. It's literally choices inside people's brains.
Right. And look, part of this is insider trading, right? I think we need to start to think about it really in those terms. It's illegal in the stock market. It should be illegal on the betting market. And I think we need to have, really much stricter guardrails when we talk about poly market, or when we talk about, taking out positions on energy in advance of a war, during a war, et cetera. All of these things need to be better regulated. And I do have a lot of doubts as to whether the Treasury Department and the Justice Department are fully prepared for the era that we've already entered. I think that's hugely problematic. I think there's something else, though, that I'm more concerned about right now, and that is the way in which markets have moved in response to a statement by the president, or even sometimes the spokesperson for the president. In other words, now we're close to a deal, and all of a sudden the price of oil drops, right? Or we're going to bomb this country back to the Stone Age. All of a sudden the price of oil, goes sky high. And you can see the way in which the markets pivot just on a few words. And this, I don't recall it ever quite being this sensitive and moving in this way. And I think there needs to be some baseline of understanding about how to regulate all of this. I'm not saying that Donald Trump has benefited from this, but I can tell you that if people have advance notice of what speechwriters have written for the president, that actually represents a huge money-making opportunity for, as you call them, wartime profiteers. This is an insane thing that it's a new wrinkle in an already complex situation, and we need to get a better handle on it. But those statements really are what bothers me.
There has been some questionable trade and movements in the market just before statements by the president or, changes in policy. I mean, there hasn't been any charges leveled against anyone in the administration, but clearly there's information flowing to that.
Look, it is an unfortunate fact that everybody, including people who admire Trump, have to deal with, that there is bizarre, nepotistic, double, triple, quadruple dealing going on with the children of members of this administration. Not just Trump's own son-in-law, but Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary's children, and others going around the world, Bitcoining, this, that, the other thing, playing games with their position that make Hunter Biden's $10 million contracts, look like he won, a gumball out of a gumball machine. Compared to what
there were questions with the Witkoffs also while Steve was conducting foreign affairs.
So we are in a very weird position where the administration seems not only not to be thinking that it should be Caesar's wife, but that it should be the Wynn family and like betting on or they should be Pete Rose, and it is. That is a kind of permission structure, to use our friend Noah's old term, that suggests a kind of loosening of the grip of proper international hygiene relating to matters that get people killed and that control economies.
John, I'm going to have to jump here in a minute, but the thing that I mean, in addition to just the way that markets have moved, in response to speeches that are prepared or sometimes unprepared, is certainly one thing that I'm concerned about. The other is, these are all, at least purportedly, moves that are being made in anticipation of policies that, at least in theory, are designed to benefit the United States. The question then becomes, do people start to make moves in the other direction where they undermine the interests of the United States, and money is made that way as well? And that is, I think, the real concern here, right? That with the wrong people having their levers or hands on their levers of power, what does that do? There can be a lot of money made in ways that should make us all very concerned.
Okay, well, Johnson Schanzer, you got to go. I want to go on a little further. So, as ever, unbelievably illuminating, and you're in a reasonably good mood, I think, actually, for you on this show. So I'm glad that if we're Prozac for you, that's that's really, I don't know where you were before, but we're not.
You might have to re-examine his life choices. If
it's
that's
true,
but
anyway.
All right, guys, take care.
So I did want to make a recommendation before we go, unless anybody has anything else you want to bring up. Okay, my recommendation is one of the most positive that I have made in the history of the Commentary Recommends. It is a memoir by Nicholas Lemann called Returning. I will stipulate that Nick is a friend of mine, though ideologically we are not particularly congruent, but he is a friend of mine. His wife is a friend of mine. His daughter is a friend of my daughter's. But he is a award-winning journalist of 50 years standing, winner of the Pulitzer Prize for his remarkable book, The Promised Land, wrote a very important book on the SAT called The Big Test, which was, I think, of immense help to Abe when Abe was trying to formulate and deal with articles we started publishing in the early 2010s about what meritocracy meant in the United States and how maybe we shouldn't be standing here on the right defending meritocracy, because what a meritocracy was and had become was different from what we thought it was. And the big test played a role in Abe's formulation of those ideas. So he's a somewhat heterodox liberal thinker. But this book, Returning: A Search for Home Across 3 Centuries, is a memoir about Lemann's family. Very interesting journey. He comes from New Orleans, and his family members got to Louisiana in the 1830s or the 1840s and started setting up shop. And his father ended up his grandfather, his father were important lawyers in New Orleans after a couple of generations in which they ran plantations, they had slaves, they set up shops, they did various types of things, and yet remained Jews through thick and thin, did not convert out, but led this very peculiar Jewish, ultra reform Jewish life in New Orleans. His great grandfather married a Cajun woman from the area. She converted to Judaism. He actually moved his family to New York in the 1850s so that his children could get some semblance of a Jewish life, since there was literally no community there, but then returned home and built this life. And the portrait of this world of Jews who remained Jews but were unbelievably conscious about not being too Jew, not asserting any kind of pride, identity, or separateness to the extent that they possibly could, since everybody knew who they were, everybody knew what they believed, and all of that. There was no need for them to proudly wear the baggage of separation, and the kinds of compromises that they made along the way in order to maintain their own viability within the system in this very peculiar southern city with its own very peculiar set of cultural rules and preconditions. How these people related to Israel, which is to say they were extremely hostile, how they related to the outward expression of religion and religiosity, to which they were extremely hostile, and yet nonetheless remained Jewish. And then along comes Nick Lemann, who goes off to Harvard like his father and his grandfather, and starts feeling in his 20s and 30s, starts feeling a pull he cannot understand to understanding the faith of his ancestors, and how that pull gradually dragged him almost unwillingly into a form of conservative observance that was disturbing and discomforting to his father, who had long ago made peace with the idea that it was fine to be a Jew as long as you didn't wear a kippah, as long as you didn't pray openly, as long as you didn't do much and make much of a show of who you were. And it is a uniquely American story. As an American memoir, it stands very much in the, particularly over the last 25 years, as a kind of layered portrait of American history, personal history, family history, regional history, cultural history, religious history. It's very original. It's beautiful. It's extremely moving. It's like a kind of listening to a great old family saga being spun out over time. That's Returning by Nicholas Lemann. I cannot recommend it more highly. I believe that my special pleading here. Nick's published a bunch of books in the years that we've done the podcast, and I've never recommended one. So just to make it
spell
clear,
his name for our listeners
yes,
who don't know.
Lemann, Nicholas Lemann. And man, oh man, like did he hit this one? Did he hit this one out of the park? So, Returning by Nicholas Lemann. We'll be back tomorrow. For Abe, Seth, and Christine, I'm John Butthortz. Keep the candle burning.